Well, you may notice a little bit of tension in the music we have sung together and that the band sang to us, and some of the other things that are going to be said today. But never fear, that's part of the plan. All shall be well, but how shall it? Especially when something else often happens. So I think we're probably all in pursuit of happy endings. I think that's a pretty safe guess. We want good outcomes to our plans. We want good luck and smooth sailing even when we haven't made plans. I personally love it when I plan A and B, and on the way home I'll do C, and boom, it happens just like that. I love that, except often that doesn't happen. Something else happens. But anyway, I still love stories with good endings. I still do, in spite of all of that. And so great endings to stories are different one from the other. For instance, I liked listening to Todd's message last week, and I listened to it online because I was absent, and by the way, you can do that too. You can go online and listen to it. He was talking about Alexander the Great making a visit to the very odd yet wise Diogenes. One of the odd things about Diogenes is that he made public statements about wealth and about materialism, and to demonstrate what he was talking about, he gave his clothes away and went about in his underwear. He was said to sun himself at the city gate. And so anyway, for whatever reason, maybe that one and many others, Alexander decides to pay him a visit. So as the Great and his entourage are standing visiting Diogenes, Alexander says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" To which Diogenes replies, "Yeah, you can move over, you're blocking my sunlight." So the good ending for that is that Alexander did not relieve Diogenes of his head for such impertinence. So sometimes endings are taking different forms. I loved hearing you talk about that, Kirk, by the way. It was really fun to hear that. So another story I heard, see if you like this one. This is a different kind of ending. So there was a story about an earthquake that shook a Zen temple. You know, it wouldn't be 11/11 if we didn't have a good Zen story, right? So it was a significant quake, even causing some of the ceiling to fall in. But the master teacher, led the monks to a safe place to the middle of the monastery, and it was the kitchen. That was the safe place. And when the earth settled back down, he said to the monks, "Now you have witnessed the calm and the cool that is in the possession of a great master, because I led us here to this safe place, and none of us were harmed." Now, I will admit to you that I felt some fear inside of me, because I am mindful, I am self-aware, and I noticed fear, and maybe you noticed a manifestation of my fear as well when you saw me drink a really big glass of water in one gulp. I don't usually do that. As he said this, he looked across the room and he sees another monk kind of suppressing a smile, and the teacher says, "What are you laughing about?" He says, "Well, actually, it wasn't water. It was a big glass of soy sauce." So sometimes stories just have crazy endings, and that's the way they go. So we have in front of us some stories that Sherry read and that Jesus told that seem to have really good endings. So let's just talk about those just a minute. The three parables are kind of similar to each other in some ways. In the first one, there's great loss, and then there's a bumper crop. I always imagine that this was more than the farmer expected. And I imagine him going door to door asking to borrow wheelbarrows to haul that crop in. And then there's the enigmatic parable of the yeast, the woman hiding yeast in the flour. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about this, including the fact that it's a very short story and you're kind of left hanging and you're wondering, well, what? But the other thing, or maybe the first thing is, in the version that we read, we find her hiding the yeast. And I think we should not think of those little packages of dry yeast that we get in the store. This is more like sourdough starter, and you may know how that works. You put some flour and some water together over in a warm place for some days, and then the chemical reaction happens, and the gas bubbles up, and that stuff becomes the starter. So that's kind of what that is, and so she puts this with the flour. And so she had some waiting to do on that end of the process, as well as when she's kneading the dough and rising the bread. But that's not all that unusual. What is unusual to me is the word hide. Some English versions, I guess figuring we wouldn't get it otherwise, say that she mixed the yeast in the flour. And okay, technically that is what she did, good enough. But the word hide, which is in the Greek, why would Jesus say that? I wonder about it. Certainly what the woman was doing was not going to be hidden for long, because she was going to put that in that flour. And here's the second interesting thing about this parable. It says 3 measures of flour. Now, you may read some other versions that tell you something else, but do you know how much 3 measures of flour is? It's 144 cups. That's about 60 dozen biscuits. Now, our friends right here, Don and Tamara, make biscuits every Sunday morning for the homeless breakfast, but y'all don't make 60 dozen, do you? No, we do not. That's a lot of biscuits. So once again, this parable has this element of surprise, of abundance, to be sure. Somehow, something about yeast hiding in the dough. But it also has ordinariness. Just a woman baking bread. And I don't have time to do this today, but you might be interested to know that the idea of 3 measures of flour actually reaches back to the Old Testament. There's other stories that have something to say about 3 measures of flour. It might be fun to look at them. But my reason for making this little parenthetical statement about it being in the Old Testament is that I think it would be so good if we remembered that the Gospels are very Jewish books. They were about a Jewish teacher, about Jesus, a Jewish man. And I just wonder, had we Christians from the get-go understood that, embraced it, appreciated it, would the anti-Semitism that fermented throughout Christian ages have grown as it did? That's for another sermon and for your thoughts later, but we are reading Jewish literature written about a Jewish man and his people, and Christians have done violence to it, myself included. Finally, we have the parable of the guy who caught all those fish, and we see this really small detail. It says there were fish of every kind. And yeah, the parable ends up saying that the guy sits on the beach and throws out the bad ones and keeps the good ones, but that does not eliminate the element of every kind. So just hold on to that a minute. So these stories, again, have the elements of abundance, of surprise, of potentially things turning out better than you thought, so happy ending stories, right? And perhaps even exceeding our expectations. And somehow Jesus says this is a reflection of the kingdom of heaven. And no doubt we hear in these stories something wonderful and hopeful. But I don't think that the kingdom of heaven is just about success and prosperity. I don't think you think that. About great endings, about our every effort and our every relationship. These stories just are not promising anything like that. They take place against the backdrop of normal human existence, lived in community, crops and bread and fish. They're sold and shared. Things that could fail the very next day. These stories are against that backdrop. The goodness of the kingdom of heaven does not exist somewhere separate from sorrow and trouble and ordinary life with all of its attendant losses and disappointments. Unfortunately, things are just not always easy. Right, Brad?